Um, okay, now I still can see you all, amazingly enough. This is not a particularly elaborate paper, but I'll I'll just go through it. And it's also short, so we should have plenty of time to discuss these ideas. That's my hope. I was asked by Rabbi Shabtai to address the topic of religious commitment and moral decency. Since I'm against them both, I thought I was a counterintuitive choice. I propose to do so by transposing the question into the terms of self-transcendence. I will be drawing extensively on the thought of the Canadian Jesuit theologian and philosopher Bernard Lonergan. The views I will advance are those I have learned from him, although I'm not giving him lots of citation. However, developing an interpretation of Lonergan is outside my terms of reference. As will be obvious, this is not an erudite paper. Those who would like one are referred to chapter 3 of my book. These remarks, the present ones that is, are substantially borrowed from a set of notes I prepared for students in an undergraduate course. They have the merit of being brief and to the point. They have the demerit, in relation to the present purpose, of being simplified and making reference to materials and topics introduced at earlier points in the course. I think, nevertheless, they may provide a suitable basis for our discussion. First then, what is transcendence? Transcendence means going beyond. Self-transcendence means going beyond oneself. One goes beyond oneself intellectually by asking and answering questions, morally by deciding and acting on the basis of values rather than on the basis of satisfactions, pleasures, and pains, and religiously by devoting oneself to transcendent reality. So in a sense, the question about religion and moral decency has to do with the relationship between these three different aspects of self-transcendence. Second, intellectual self-transcendence. Intellectual self-transcendence is a matter of learning. Learning occurs by asking and answering questions. When you ask further questions, you grow your understanding and your knowledge. You're going beyond your present understanding and knowledge. Fundamentally, there are two different kinds of questions, questions for understanding and questions for judgment. The question for understanding is looking for a reason or a cause or an explanation. It is not answered by a yes or a no, but by some kind of idea. The question for judgment is asking whether an idea is true, whether I've understood correctly. It is looking for evidence, and it is answered by a yes or a no, a probably, a maybe, or perhaps, etc., depending on how sufficient the evidence is. Permit me an illustration. If I ask, what is a bicycle wheel, or why is this wheel round, or how does a bicycle wheel work, I'm looking for some kind of explanation, a cause or a reason why this contraption before me is a bicycle. Well, sort of. I've moved from a wheel to a bicycle. Oh, well. Now, those are three different questions, but they are all of the same basic kind, because in each case, I'm looking for some kind of explanation, a reason or a cause. I'm looking to understand something. So fundamentally, these three questions are really different variations on the same basic type of question, which is a question for understanding. Let's suppose my question is, why is this wheel round? Or make it practical. Why is this wheel, I mean the rim, not the tire, not round anymore, and how do I make it round again? The wheel is true if it's both concentric and in plane, and it's out of true if it has bumps or dents or wobbles side to side. Suppose after working at this question for a while, I have an idea. I can make the wheel true by tensioning the spokes. But will my idea work? Maybe I'm mistaken. Let me experiment a little. Now I've moved on to another type of question. My idea could be wrong. There's only one way to find out, let's suppose, checking. Checking is a way of turning up evidence, and only evidence will permit me to say, yes, I was right, or no, I was not right. It's only when we reach the question for judgment, then, that we have a complete increment of knowing. Until then, we're just thinking about things. We really don't know if our thoughts are correct. Questions are not always explicit. Sometimes we don't formulate them. Sometimes we don't formulate what we are wondering about, but we do wonder and we do criticize. And by criticism, I don't mean carping. I mean, we don't just want any old idea. We'd like to know if our ideas are correct. If I try to explain things to my dogs, they go to sleep. Their world is the world of the sensorium. Your world is much larger than your sensorium. It is a world of stories and histories and politics and science. We access that world through the questions that emerge from wonder. Since we all began as babbling babies knowing practically nothing, we have all had to grow into our meaningful worlds by learning. Because we are intelligent, our learning comes naturally to us. Children learn without becoming even aware that they're learning. Our dog Opus has lived in our family for 9 years. All that time he has been immersed in an English-speaking environment, but he probably knows about 10 words, and even then his knowledge of them is restricted to associative conditioning. If that happened to one of my children, we should all think something was very gravely wrong. We learn before we know we are learning, but part of becoming an adult is the discovery of oneself as a learner. Children in elementary school or in secondary school are put through their paces. Someone else arranges the conditions of their learning for them. But you, I'm addressing my students when I say that, are now adults, and a large part of adulthood is taking responsibility for your own learning. Notice that intellectual self-transcendence is not spatial. Developing your understanding is not a matter of growing physically larger. It is a matter of understanding more. And understanding more is not an event in space, even if it does involve your brain. Moral self-transcendence. Theoretically, it might be possible to make all of your choices simply on the basis of your personal calculus of pleasure and pain. That kind of decision-making would not be self-transcending, it would be self-referential. Self-transcending decisions are motivated and regulated by values. By value, I mean the good as a possible object of rational choice. For example, you decided to go to university even though it is costly for your families and difficult for you. Presumably, you did not go to university just to enjoy 4 years of partying in the mods. The mods are a notorious campus housing. I'm sure your universities have an equivalent campus housing with equivalent notoriety for student partying. That would be a self-indulgent motive, not a self-transcending motive. What is the value of an education? Typically in America, we talk about value in terms of money. So we're apt to say that the value of an education is that it will get you a good job, and a good job will make you lots of money. More money than a good education will cost you. But if you ask yourself this question, if I could make the same amount or even more money without an education, would I still want to be educated? Maybe the answer is no, you wouldn't want to be educated. Oops, there I go. Instead, if you could make more money being uneducated, instead you would just play Smash all day. But if the answer is yes, you would still want to be educated, then there must be some value to education that is not economic. I'm suggesting a point about education, but more importantly, I'm suggesting a point about moral self-transcendence. We choose things for reasons. We can reflect on whether the reasons are good or not. When we do that, we're on the cusp of moral self-transcendence. We're beginning to get beyond our personal pleasures and pains and asking about what would be actually worthwhile, even if it were unpleasant or even painful. That's a concern with value, with the good as the prospective object of rational choice. Of course, just asking about value is only the beginning of moral self-transcendence. It's not really complete until we make a choice and carry it out. And even single choices are just increments of moral self-transcendence. You might decide to go to university, apply, enroll, and start. But you might give up because it's difficult. The point is that you have to decide and keep on deciding. Earlier, we mentioned that an important part of becoming an adult is taking responsibility for your own learning. But taking responsibility for your own learning is a way of taking responsibility for who you are becoming. Then you are not only choosing about particular options, for instance, whether to major in biology, econ, or psych, you are also choosing to become a particular kind of person. The choice to become a self-directed learner is a moral choice. It is the choice of values, including the value of a version of yourself. What is true of learning is true in its own way of all your other choices. When you choose how you will spend your time or how you will treat your roommates or your parents or your siblings or your friends, etc., you are also choosing to become a certain kind of person. You are deciding what you really love and becoming a certain kind of lover. In C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, we see lots of examples of this. That's a book that I have them read at the beginning of the course. For Lewis and for Christianity generally, the fundamental contrast is between love of self and love of value or God. Because my students are overwhelmingly secular and have all kinds of weird prepackaged ideas about what God means, try and bounce them off it a little bit by get them to think about God as the ultimate good. Otherwise, when they read Augustine, they just cannot make any sense of what he's talking about. But this contrast has to be understood carefully. The contrast, that is, between the two loves. That is because you too are of value, and indeed of very great value. So the choice is not really between loving yourself versus loving true values, as if loving true values excluded you. In fact, you cannot be a true friend to anyone else unless you are also a true friend to yourself. The difficulty is that true friendship to yourself, that is, effectively willing what is best for you, cannot mean simply willing to maximize your pleasures. Pleasure can be a value, but it is not identical to value, and it is not the highest value. In the end, then, the contrast between love of self and love of value, the contrast is not between love of self and love of value. It is between a pleasure-centered way of relating to the world and a value-centered way. The kind of person one is becoming is one's character. So we say a person has a selfish character or a kind or loving character and so forth. Character is the product of choices over time. Further, one's feelings are fundamentally spontaneous. They're not directly controllable, but they can be developed and shaped over time. We should also be very careful to distinguish moral evil from physical privation. This isn't actually a complete disjunction, but we'll leave it to the side. Physical privation is the suffering of one's body, but moral evil is choosing against value. Soldiers accept privation and even death in order to serve their country. Parents accept all kinds of privations for the benefit of their children. Nurses and doctors work long and weary hours, accepting risk of illness for their patients. Friends suffer on behalf of their friends. Athletes train and in some sense punish their bodies and appetites in order to get stronger. In every case, what is chosen is a positive good, a moral value, and what is accepted as its price is a physical privation. Note, therefore, that physical privation is not the basic meaning of evil. There are many things worse than physical privation. Moral evil is worse. Religious self-transcendence. I had hoped to have time, which I haven't had because I have another deadline looming over me that I've already missed and I'm making somebody wait. But to expand this section with a discussion of Abraham Joshua Heschel, because we read a book by him in the course, but I haven't had time to do that. So here's what you get. Then we can talk about it. Religious self-transcendence. We've already mentioned that in some way we become what we love. That is, what we love settles what gets us out of bed in the morning, how we choose to spend our time, what we're prepared to sacrifice for. There are different kinds of love. Perhaps the most basic is the love that binds a family together. Then there is the love that links friends. The best marriage perhaps combines these loves together so that it is not only a partnership of life, but also a friendship. Then there's the love that one has for one's fellow human beings, or for at least for one's community and fellow citizens. Besides these loves, there is the possibility of an unconditional love. The first and basic commandment in the Bible, from which all others flow, is to love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Every great religious tradition, I think, teaches some version of these commands even the ones that do not use the term God. Now, that's a discussable proposition. This kind of love is radically unconditional. It asks for all. It does not admit of qualifications or reservations. Because it asks for all, religious love can dominate a life. It can become the basis for everything else that is valued, sought, or chosen. Now, what I don't talk about here and would be worth talking about is the ways that that can go wrong, of course. I mean, in other words, we might say there are genuine and ungenuine ways of being religious. Transcendent reality. Intellectual, moral, and religious self-transcendence raise the question of transcendent reality. What is transcendent reality? It is a reality beyond the limits and conditions of this world. In fact, it is a reality beyond any limits and conditions whatever. Because we can raise further questions, we know that we do not know everything. Because the whole universe of our experience is conditional, we know that the order of the universe is not self-explanatory. Each event that occurs, each thing that exists has its causes and conditions. If my parents had not met, I would not be here. But my parents' meeting had prior conditions and so forth. Similarly, though we choose things because they are or seem worthwhile, we know that they are not the ultimate value in the universe. Your education is a good for you. It is also a good for society in as much as it puts you in a position to make a greater contribution to the historical development of the human good. An order that provided an education for everyone who wants it would be a good too. Not a particular good and not just a sustained flow of particular goods, but a whole complex arrangement of capacities and desires, skills and roles and institutions, and so forth. Such an arrangement illustrates the meaning of a good of order. The good of order is what is functioning well when the economy is growing and what is not functioning well when the economy is in a recession, or what is functioning well in a healthy natural ecology and not functioning well in a deteriorating natural ecology. But what I want you to notice is that particular goods, your education, and goods of order, the educational system, are both conditional. They only happen or function if certain conditions are fulfilled. And those conditions have their own conditions and so on. The universe then is not self-explanatory. It is a conditional order that happens to exist. Goods too are not self-explanatory, at least contingent and finite goods. They exist or occur because the conditions happen to be fulfilled for them. These observations raise the question of a transcendent reality. Is there a reality that is strictly unconditioned? A reality that has no conditions whatever? A reality that is completely self-explanatory and capable of explaining everything else? Absolute good beyond any valid criticism, and likewise completely independent of conditions outside itself. In the Western tradition, transcendent reality is usually named God. God is not the name of an item in the world. God is not the name of a datum to be explained. God is the name of the ultimate reality beyond this world that makes the world possible, that explains why there is something rather than nothing, that explains why anything is ultimately valuable or worthwhile. Whether there is a transcendent reality or whether the transcendent reality has the attributes traditionally assigned to God is a question for later. Here, however, we may note that it is not a question that arises or that can be settled within the domain of the natural sciences. The goal of the sciences is the experimentally verifiable explanation of phenomena. But God is not directly a datum or phenomenon of our experience in this life, not directly. We can talk about that too. Nor is God a hypothesis to be experimentally verified or falsified. God, rather, names the ultimate condition of the possibility of all phenomena and all true value. Nor does the question arise within religious studies, for religious studies study religious phenomena, but do not claim to settle whether or in what sense the claims of a religion are true. Hence, if there is a valid knowledge of God, it will have to pertain to philosophy, religion, or theology. More on this in the next unit. The function of religion. Previously in the course, we compared functional and substantive approaches to religion. We said that a substantive approach defines religion in terms of its objects. A functional approach defines religion in terms of its effects. The difficulty with a functional approach is that it seems reductive. It defines religion in terms of other purposes religion serves. But religion could not serve those purposes unless it were at least perceived to be something else. People aren't religious because it's socially beneficial. It may be socially beneficial that they're religious. But it's possible to conceive a functional approach that is not reductive by asking about the function of religion within the context of human self-transcendence. We cannot live intelligently, reasonably, and responsibly without asking questions, without deliberating about what is worthwhile, without acting accordingly. But inexorably, our questions of fact and of value reach out toward the whole of the universe. Thus, if to live fully as a human being means to stand by the requirements of intelligence, reason, responsibility, and self-transcending love, then we cannot live fully without some orientation to the whole of the universe, some apprehension of our role and place within it, some ultimate motivation and regulation for human living. It is the function of religion to provide such an orientation and apprehension. And where one religion is driven out, some other ideology will always seem ready to take its place. Summary. Since transcendence means to go beyond, self-transcendence is going beyond yourself. This self-transcendence, going beyond the self you presently are and thereby becoming, this is self-transcendence, going beyond the self you presently are and thereby becoming a fuller, more complete person. We distinguish three basic kinds or aspects of self-transcendence: intellectual, moral, and religious. The most elementary form of self-transcendence is raising further questions. When you raise further questions, you're likely to learn something. By learning, you're growing your understanding and knowledge. You discover the world as it really is, independently of your wishes and preferences. Growing your understanding and knowledge is one way of going beyond yourself. It is intellectual self-transcendence. A second form is moral. To grasp the notion of moral self-transcendence, distinguish between two bases or criteria for decision-making. We can choose and act on the basis of what is pleasing to ourselves. When we choose this way, we seek to maximize our satisfaction, minimize our discomfort or dissatisfaction. But choosing and acting on the basis of what is pleasing to me is not properly self-transcending. It is self-referential or self-collapsing. It considers everything in relation to me and my desires. The proper criterion of moral self-transcendence is values, the good, as the object of rational choice. Deciding and acting are self-transcending if they are motivated by values. They're not self-transcending if they're motivated merely by a calculus of pleasures and pains. A third form is religious. It is the displacement of concern from the conditional order of this universe to ultimate meaning and value. Some 60 years ago, Friedrich Heiler identified 7 principal areas common to the world religions. Permit me to briefly summarize them. There is a transcendent or supreme reality. It is also immanent in human hearts. This reality is the supreme good, also supreme love and mercy. The way to life is through practices of devotion, love of neighbor, and loving union with the supreme reality. There is, of course, no sense in which I'm doing justice to his argument, but I think it provides a good preliminary statement, core of religious experience. A Christian might begin with the last of Heiler's areas and affirm a universal gift of God's love as the basis for love of neighbor, devotion, and sacrifice. Through this love, God dwells in our hearts as in a temple, is disclosed as the beginning and beyond of all things, merciful and the transcendent good. Thus, Heiler's 7 areas appear to be so many effects of grace, that is, of the love of God poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. The harvest of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's St. Paul. In short, religion is a fundamental aspect, and I would say the most fundamental aspect of self-transcendence in human living. Now, okay, so that's the end of that. Obviously, for lots of different reasons, but mainly that have to do with the ordering of the material in the course. I didn't talk about Christ at all in here, which a Christian needs to get to. But anyway, so that's that. The reason, so I'm going to stop the share for a second. The reason that I chose to do that is just that I thought it gave a kind of a brief and compendious kind of statement of some issues that would be a good basis for our discussion. So rather than give you a long and kind of erudite paper, what I really wanted to do was be able to talk about some of these issues with you. And I thought a nice short synopsis would be a good basis for that. So even though that's kind of a simplified thing, and there's lots of further complications that a person might add, I'll leave it at that size and we'll see how the discussion unfolds. I can't hear you, Rabbi, because you're muted.
It's the best when I'm muted. You spoke about the self-transcendence. It's that you are guided by values, and I wanted to ask where the values come from. Values are words, so the words can come from a religious source or a book or text, but the meaning of the values and the way to apply them and the way to judge and balance them, where does it come from?
Well, I mean, what I mean by value is the good as a perspective object of rational choice. So I think the good is reasonable, or values have to be reasonable, and they have to be subject to some kind of rational consideration about whether this is a good thing for me. So, I mean, part of the thing is to talk about something as objectively good, you have to say it's objectively good for what? And if you want to say, well, it's objectively good for human beings, then you have to, I think at the end of the day, have some kind of teleological anthropology that says this is what human beings are for. So the reason I like this notion of self-transcendence is I think it's a way of articulating a kind of a normative teleological anthropology that kind of recovers that classic tradition of having a normative teleological anthropology, a goal-oriented anthropology, in a way that I think is actually verifiable in experience. Students can verify the experience that they have questions, and the questions carry with them criteria of what constitutes a good answer, what would constitute a good answer to that question. So you can get them to start thinking about the idea of, well, good for what? Well, good as an answer to this question, for example, and so forth. So, I think the values have to be, it has to have to do with objective reality in relation to benefit to some subject or something like that. But I think one last thing is, I mean, when you're talking about the good, you're really talking about the whole order of the universe, right? I mean, Aristotle or the scholastics say, bonum est quod omnia appetunt, the good is what everything desires. But if the good is the object of the desire, then presumably the desire also is good, and the desirer is good, and the capacity of the desire to desire is good, and the capacity of the desire to achieve the object is good, and the coordination of desirers in pursuit of the objects is good. So your really good ultimately is going to be turn out to be convertible with being, with the whole universe that actually is. But that's a complicated problem that I don't go there with my with my kiddos, because then the problem of evil has to be dealt with in a more serious way too.
What if, may I? What if one of these students would ask you about the value that you put up there as being objective and
Right.
something that is worth making sacrifices for, right? And so your example with the athlete,
Sure.
who is giving up certain immediate pleasures. In fact, he is willing to incur some pain in order to get stronger. Why? Because he is going to feel better when he is stronger. So he's actually just giving up some instant gratification for a later, greater gratification. So how do you answer this hedonistic objection to,
Yeah.
what you're calling value is nothing but just a greater pleasure, and that we are calculating our ways toward?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it does arise in various ways because
I know. So I'm just curious
yeah,
how
I mean,
you would answer it.
you probably get it in your students too. I mean, they're all basically, their default setting is a kind of a moral relativism. So Mother Teresa is no more morally excellent than they are. It's just that she's driven by different pleasures than they are. So she's maximizing her pleasure and they're maximizing their pleasure. You know, I think it's kind of a tricky question to get them to really think about. I get them to think about, I mean, normally the way it comes up pedagogically with courses, so this kind of intro to theology is not the thing that I normally teach, or really even the thing that I particularly prefer to teach. I teach a course where we start, the basic main first thing that we read is the Republic. And so we work through Socrates' kind of discussion about, you know, we use examples like, what constitutes goodness in a piano player? On the basis of what do we say that someone is a good piano player? And they have to realize, well, okay, you have to define the good in relation to some kind of a function. And so a good piano player is able to play at will what she wants to play, and so on and so forth. Now, with Aristotle, pleasure does enter into it, because the fact that it's pleasurable is actually part of what makes it to be virtuous. Whereas with somebody like Kant, it's almost like, well, if you like it too much, maybe it's not really virtuous. So, you know, they can recover the possibility that enjoying something can be part of the mix of its value, but it can't be the foundation of its value. You have to do the foundation of its value by thinking, basically, I mean, I think you have to have some kind of teleology, and that's the way the ancients do it. And the problem is that gets very complicated in the sort of post or anti-Aristotelian West. And so you have to think about, well, how do you recover some kind of teleology? I get them to think about what they're doing when they're asking and answering questions, or when they're having a conversation together in the class. And I say, well, look, is your goal in the conversation that you just want to look good or triumph over the other people because that'll make you feel good? Or are we actually trying to figure something out? And most of the students realize nobody wants to say, my motivation in having a conversation with the rest of you people is just so that I can impress you with how great I am, then I can go home and feel good about myself. They all realize that would be a wholly insufficient motivation. None of them would want to be treated that way, and they realize they just can't treat the others that way either, or the exercise. So, you know, those are the kinds of things that I get them to try and do.
And perhaps you can also push them further and further. And if they insist on regarding that further value and achievable end, and an end to be achieved as some sort of pleasure, and no matter how rarefied and subtle form of pleasure, it is still pleasure. They can stretch the meaning of the word pleasure as far as until it becomes the same as what you mean by value, and then
Right.
then game over.
There's no doubt that that's right. I mean, at some point you have to show them that they're equivocating.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But that's that's another issue. I mean, it's a little bit of a tactical thing, as you know, when you're dealing in a conversation with students. You're just trying to figure out, okay, exactly what's the next problem that's going to arise, and how do you want to kind of lead them. But I really try pedagogically to make the students sort of think the things through as much as they can for themselves, because if I'm telling them, it's just another adult telling them be moral.
Of course, you can say that the pleasure is a constant in human nature and maybe in all biology.
Sure.
Pleasure is something that is the motivating force. I
Yeah.
just want to follow what Julia said, that all you have to show is the transformation in what pleases you. So when you are a baby, eating pleases you and being warm and
Right.
protected, and then the pleasure goes on. So it's not transcendence, it's the opposite. You can concentrate on the pleasure and just change what pleases you.
Yeah.
So
That.
it may be totally virtuous to be guided by your pleasure.
Yeah. That's true, and that's a discussion. You know, when I do our kind of great books, first year program is called Perspectives, and we read Plato and we read Aristotle. When you read Aristotle, I mean, he's really talking about in the ethics, the central problem really is, how do I become virtuous? And one of the things that's exactly an explicit topic in there, Rabbi, is the thing that you're mentioning, which is that your center of virtue, your center of pleasure, what brings you pleasure, is changing as you're growing. So that, you know, you initially start to do things and they're actually difficult for you. And, you know, we talk a lot about his example of, well, if you don't already have a virtue, how do you practice it? And he says, well, if you don't have the virtue, you're going to have a hard time figuring out what the mean is. But you're usually going to have an easier time figuring out where you tend to go wrong. You know, you generally will know, well, I'm a person who eats too much. I don't know what the right amount to eat is, but I'm pretty sure I'm eating too much. And then he just says, well, you err on the other side, and gradually you kind of calibrate yourself. And so that's a problem. There's both of calibrating your moral sensibility by the acquisition of the virtue, but it's also doing the thing that you're describing, which is it's transforming what gives you pleasure. Because as you become virtuous, doing the right thing comes easily and spontaneously and pleasurably to you. And that's very helpful to them too, because it gets them out of thinking about it as it's just law or whatever. Or, you know, like at the end of the course, we read, one of the last things we read is the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And, you know, Kant basically, he's so strict about, you have to do it because you recognize it as your duty. And there's almost this kind of general sense that he leaves you with, which is, if you really enjoy it, then you're probably not doing it because it's your duty, and that's not right. And that's very different. Aristotle is much more sane than Kant. He realizes, I mean, I think partly because he has this kind of more robust teleology, that the whole person is being transformed by the practice of these things.
But would you believe that at a certain point, again, if we follow this line of thinking, a person could do the opposite thing? He could be guided by his pleasure. At some point, you will see what he should be guided by his pleasure, because his pleasure is the proper compass.
Yeah, that's great. So I think there's a way in which that's right. Augustine says, love God and do what you will. But that's at the end of the journey. That's at the end of the journey, when you're fully given over to love, then you do the things that love needs you to do, and they're the right things. But that can't be the way, that can't be the starting point of the thing, because initially there's the enormous problem of developing your moral sensibility in such a way that the things that bring you pleasure really are the best and right things. that are healthy for you. So the kids, one of the things about teleology is you have to consider the possibility that some of the things I enjoy, insofar as I'm not yet virtuous, but only becoming virtuous, many of the things I enjoy or that bring me pleasure are actually not good for me. They're actually harmful to me or destructive of me in a lot of different ways. And, you know, the kind of austerity of Socrates, who's able to say, you know, I'm not leaving Athens because I've made my covenant with the city, and it would be doing wrong, and so I'll just take my lumps. That's what I agreed to do, and it's better to endure wrong than to do it. That's so far from what their moral experience prepares them to contemplate, because their initial thing is to identify the evil with the painful, or with suffering, and so you also have to force them into thinking about the fact that actually suffering is not the fundamental meaning of evil and can't be the fundamental meaning of evil. You know, we read the Passion of our Lord, and there's the suffering is all endured by Christ, but the evil is all endured by his torturers, or is all committed by his torturers. And the kids get that. You know, then they're like, oh, well, of course.
You spoke about the parents suffering for the kids' behavior, and
yes,
we Jews have it. You know, we have. I don't know if Bill knows it. Polish parents, and the thing of Polish parents is you should know how much I suffer for your good. This is the thing. And once you emphasize with the child, you kill everything. This is the best way to kill everything.
yes.
I present myself as a martyr for your good.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is parenting is hard. And my experience of it has involved making tons of mistakes and regretting them. And
this is being recorded.
Yeah, that's fine. It's fine. I feel okay to admit this. Parenting is hard, and your kids are changing all the time. So just when you sort of feel like you've got a handle on what they need at this stage, then they need something else. I remember, you know, this is a little bit of a tangential anecdote, but it was a really striking thing. My son, my oldest boy, Abraham, and we were just always so close. And until he was 10, every morning at like 5 a.m, he would get out of his bed and he'd come into our bed on my side and kind of cuddle up to me for the last hour or hour and a half of sleep every morning. And I remember when this stopped, and I knew it was the end of an era, you know. But when they get into their teenage years, they start pushing away from you a little bit, and you realize, you know, you've either laid the foundation or you haven't, but they're pushing away. The problem is that presents a tremendous problem emotionally a tremendous problem, because initially I was like feeling hurt that my boy was kind of pushing me away, even though intellectually I knew, well, he needs to do that. He needs to figure out who he is and not just be me. So I mean, those things are hard to navigate, and it doesn't just require understanding something. It requires, you know, figuring out why your feelings are the way they are, and trying to mold them into the way that would be healthier. Because I didn't want to be sort of spontaneously sending cues that it's not okay when you push away. I didn't want him to have that, but I knew that I probably was radiating that because of the way I actually was feeling about the thing. So you got to do a hell of a lot of growing. But if you love your kids, then you choose it because you love your kids.
I have a question, Jeremy.
Yeah.
In talking about values,
Yes.
your discourse is very much focused upon the pleasure, and it's a kind of Aristotelian approach. with, let's say, kind of teleology, most probably I'm very much influenced here by what I'm going to say by Levinas, who says the opposite, meaning that the value, my value, is the satisfaction of the needs of the other.
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk about moral self-transcendence, this is a kind of metamorphosis of the I, which is not self-referential, but other-centered. And it is in this transcendence that, of course, Levinas situates, so to say, the perspective on the divine, meaning my infinite self-transcending brings me closer to God, and which is a distance, of course, which feeds itself upon its own hunger.
Yes.
Because the more you are close, the more you are close to God, the more you feel that you are not close, meaning that there is a transcendent aspect. So I would, in my approach, I would link the moral self-transcendence and the religious self-transcendence, but put less accent upon what is desirable for me and a pleasure, than what I have to do, meaning situating God in the infinity of my moral duties. And this kind of conversion of the I to become another is a very difficult thing, but it has everything to do with religion. Second remark, Jeremy, the last sentence of your expose was about religion as the self-transcendence of the human being. I'm much more skeptical about that, because with Jose Casanova, I think that religion has a Janus face. It could be good, but it could be also bad, as you suggested, because there is unauthentic, what you said, unauthentic.
Yes.
אני לא היחיד שנגד דת ממוסדת.
I didn't go into that in this thing, but I mean, I think you definitely could do a section on the polymorphism of religion, because it easily slips over into something that's destructive rather than constructive. So I agree with that. Regarding your first set of points, I just have two thoughts, brief. One is kind of on the substance of your point, and then the other is on why I set this up the way I did in the notes. On the substance of the thing, I think even if you say, okay, it's determined by the needs of the others or the satisfaction of the needs of the others, you still have to have some way of saying, well, what does the other really need? What really would be good for the other? And so there has to be some kind of a critique, a dialectical critique of what really the needs are and so forth, that ultimately is moving towards being able to say something constructive about what really is good for a human person, what's good for me.
When he is hungry, it's very clear.
Sure. So that's one thing. So the reason I set this up the way I did actually is in this particular course that I wrote this for, they don't read Plato and Aristotle. I don't have that kind of time with them. I have them read Lewis's The Great Divorce. I don't know if you know that text. It's kind of their initial text. And then the next really big thing that I'm having them read and write a paper on is Augustine's Confessions. And what I want them to think about is, Augustine basically, for Augustine, the tension is the love of self to the contempt of God and the love of God to the contempt of self. But our undergraduates cannot process that. They don't have any tools to sort of figure out what exactly is he talking about. So you have to help them transpose it into some terms of reference that they can deal with. So why does he say that? I say, what does Augustine mean by pride? He means self-referential love. self-referential in a way that's self-collapsing. It's not self-transcending, but self-collapsing. You're falling inward on yourself. And by love of God, he means something like, as a first approximation, a self-transcending love that's moving towards what really is objectively valuable and ultimately towards what's infinitely valuable. And you have to orient your life to that. And that's God. And that's why the dialectic for Augustine is between pride or self-love and love of God. But it's so part of what I'm trying to basically do is to build a bridge between the way Augustine is talking about these things and what my students are actually in a position to possibly hear so that they can begin to work their way into Augustine's meaning. And they come, I mean, I don't know if it's just it's probably our culture. It's maybe part of it as a universal human experience. But when these kids come into your classroom, they have such notions about God you almost have to drive them out to replace them with better notions about God. They just think about God as like Zeus or something, So you can go on with them for weeks and weeks, and you're talking about God, and they're thinking about Zeus every time they hear it. You know what I mean? And so I find that I just have to kind of do an intellectual therapy with them right away, and say this word does not mean what you probably think it means. And if you're thinking about, go ahead. Sorry. Anyway,
Sorry. I didn't mean.
You get the. Anyway, so that's part of what that's part of the problematic of the pedagogical problematic of the thing with our students. And it's basically true whether they believe in God or deny that they believe in God. Either way, they're kind of a little bit stuck in thinking about what you really mean by God.
Jeremy, I have another small question. Isn't there another kind of self-transcendence outside this intellectual and moral and religious self-transcendence? If I, for instance, talking about Heschel, if I see a beautiful sunrise, I see it every morning.
Yes.
And it's part of my prayer also.
Yes.
But I see that sunrise. I can analyze it, of course, but with Heschel, I would say the best reaction is amazement.
Yes.
Radical amazement.
That's exactly the thing that I wanted to talk about in Heschel.
Right.
Work in. So that's a kind of aesthetic. That's a kind of aesthetic self-transcendence, and that may be right. This trichotomy, it's really transposing the moral and intellectual and theological virtues, that tradition. I think that's an excellent question. I don't intend the thing to be kind of exhaustive, and I think it's a great suggestion to say, do you need something like an aesthetic mode of self-transcendence in order to kind of give a more fulsome account of the wholeness of human experience? That may be quite exactly right, and I'm grateful for the suggestion.
David, I see that you're exploding to say something, and
I'm impressed with your skills at observation. So I had actually the same line of questioning that Jula started, and really we've been on from the beginning about pleasure, because in classical thought, there's pleasure all the way up and down. But so I'm fascinated by the theme of self-transcendence as a way to communicate. One way you put it is classical thought in the modern period and or contemporary period. And but I wonder whether you haven't. So I was struggling with moral self-transcendence.
Yes.
I think you've really helped yourself a lot with your account of intellectual self-transcendence, I was fascinated by your example of why do we get an education? You know? And that dialectic that you have, well, is it for a job and why is that? I mean, is it for money and why is that good, and et cetera? And does it come back to yourself? Is it just for the sake of pleasure? And so I think I could really feel the transcendence there. I'm having a little more trouble feeling it in morality, in the moral dimension. And we're thinking of morality as much broader than, just shoulds and shouldn'ts. But I think we're on it, that is, it's not all about myself, And if I focus on the pleasure as the goal, the sole goal, that's the only criteria, it's all about myself. But there is, and so this being for the other is crucial, right? That's the beauty of the Levinas observation. But you have expressed something when you talk about values. You say it's the experience of it's the good as a subject of rational choice. So there's reason understanding the good. That already takes us out of ourselves in some way. And so this is not just an intellectual point, this is a moral point. And everyone feels this. When we do good for others, and we sacrifice. It's not what we originally wanted at all, right? We don't want to sacrifice anything, but we feel great. There's pleasure there, but it's transcending. It's self-transcending. I think that's embedded in your account already, but it's hard to tease out, right? So Kant is not so off on that point, because to focus on the rational good is to transcend ourselves. See? So that part of Kant is not so bad on your own account. Do you see what I'm getting at? So this is the same theme of seeing the good and being are convertible. Everything that it is in some way good. And the reason understands that. That already will take us at the level of action, at the level of desire, out of ourselves. If we let that, if we observe, actually we have to reflect on it to feel it, I think, to get this idea of moral self-transcendence. It's quite difficult, for me, but I really think it's already embedded in your language.
Well, I have about 3 or 4 things that these are great and helpful comments. I mean, one of the things that I want them to see and that you've kind of picked up on is,
hey, just a minute. I'm not just talking about your students. I'm talking about this reflection,
sure.
for all of us.
Yeah, that's right. That's an excellent point. One of the things I want to bring out is that they structure together. You can't have moral self-transcendence unless in some way it includes intellectual transcendence. But because moral living,
and vice versa.
And vice versa, exactly. Yeah. Because moral living presupposes getting things right, but also a commitment to getting things right is itself, in a way, a kind of a moral commitment. And excellent. So I want them to see how these things kind of structure together. Now, in the context for which I wrote this, I'm not reading Aristotle with them, so I wasn't really thinking when I was using pleasure the way I was using it about how that might play if we were discussing the way Aristotle uses it. I mean, I think that's a really nice flag. I just kind of threw that in there, and maybe I should rethink the way I'm talking about it. I think in
my view, it's important because we'll still take pleasure in sacrificing ourselves. So that's a phenomenon that is there, and that there's a way of recognizing that and still insisting it's not all just for the sake of pleasure. Well, there's pleasure in the highest action. There's pleasure in religious action, but
it goes back to Julie's initial point about different senses of pleasure, and to the rabbi's point about the fact that the center of pleasure, or the center of gravity of your pleasures, changes as you develop morally. So that's a thing that I probably definitely need to go back and kind of revisit the way I'm talking about that, because those points are all exactly right. The thing about Kant, I'm obviously giving a little bit of a caricature of Kant, but in 2 days of discussing the groundwork with students, that's the best they're getting anyway. But the thing is, Kant is obsessed about your motivation. And my own feeling is, if you know about grace, you stop worrying about that a little bit. I mean, in other words, Augustine, just to give one example, but I think really it's probably true of genuinely, I mean, anyway, whatever, I won't try and generalize the thing, but Augustine just realizes, look, I'm extremely complicated. I don't have one motivation. I've got a gazillion motivations, and they're all in conflict with each other all at the same time. All I can do is try and love God and count on God to carry me through the thing. And I just think that's much more sane. That's really the only point that I want to make about that. Rather than, kind of have them develop their scruples and worry all the time about their motivations. Well, okay, maybe you're going to Mass in the morning because you want to impress David. Maybe you're going to Mass in the morning because you love God. Maybe you're going to Mass in the morning to get out and get some fresh air. Those things could all be true. You know what I mean? Why? We're just such complicated people. We're just such messes. You can't pick yourself apart in the way that you would have to verify that you're acting not solely on the basis of the categorical imperative, your duty.
Yeah. May I
Yeah.
come up with something? Jeremy, you just mentioned how these three types of self-transcendence you distinguished are not independent and exclusive of each other. In fact, they are intertwined and sort of dependent, codependent on each other. I think Ephraim's point about what you termed as an aesthetic form of self-transcendence may be brought into the fold of this system exactly in the same way, because all this is based on the idea of the convertibility of the transcendentals.
Yes.
Right. The convertibility of being and goodness already inevitably came up in the discussion of moral self-transcendence. But the same goes for the convertibility of being and truth in connection with intellectual, and the convertibility of being and beauty would apply in the case of aesthetic self-transcendence. So all this will be brought, will be able to be brought together into a beautiful system along the lines of the transcendentals. And this is exactly, by the way, what Augustine is doing in the City of God when he is collecting the, when he is retelling the history of philosophy up to his time, and he is noticing the search for truth, being, and the good, and they all converge, and how this convergence happens in Platonic philosophy, and also with what you can learn from religion. And this is how it turns out that he who is what Plato is looking for, Moses is looking for, and even the ancient materialist philosophers were looking for. They were just looking for it in all the wrong places. So
yeah, I tend to when I talk with people, I tend to use loveliness instead of beauty, mainly to bounce off. The problem with the convertibility of beauty and being is it fits too nicely into people's reductive assumptions, because when they think about beauty, they're thinking about objects of sensitive kind of extroversion, and loveliness. I find just a rhetorical strategy kind of shakes that up a little bit when they think about what makes somebody a lovely person, or then
in fact, I would talk about aesthetic value and approaching it from its effect. It is cathartic. So, and it doesn't really have to be beautiful in the conventional sense, right? A tragedy is not ordinarily beautiful, yet it beautifully points out something truly tragic about the human condition.
Nice. Yeah.
Bill, anything? You also look as if you have a lot to say.
Yeah, I've gotten away with that for much of my career.
That is beautiful.
Right.
Now, here is some beauty.
So I fooled you again. No, actually, I have been pondering a text. I've been pondering a text in light of Julia's comment about aesthetics. And it's a text that I've been thinking about since the very beginning, Jeremy, when you're giving your talk. And it's a text I'm working on for some writing I hope I can do over the next several years. Anyhow, this is the text. And I think it brings together certain themes of moral self-transcendence, religious self-transcendence, but via the image of loveliness or beauty. And this is near the end of a novel of Marilyn Robinson's called Gilead.
Yeah.
The story is a story of the novel is a long letter that a man in his 70s is writing to his 9-year-old child. Long story, and he's a pastor. But anyhow, this is near the end. Theologians talk about a prevenient grace that precedes grace itself and allows us. I think there must also be a prevenient courage that allows us to be brave. That is to acknowledge that there is more beauty than our eyes can bear, that precious things have been put into our hands, and to do nothing to honor them is to do great harm. And therefore, this courage allows us, as the old men said, to make ourselves useful. It allows us to be generous, which is another way of saying exactly the same thing. So, I mean, I guess the idea would be what allows us, in this view, what allows us to be generous is to acknowledge something. And what you're acknowledging is that beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder, but that beauty is something that shocks us with its recognition apart from us, that there's more of that in creation than our eyes can bear.
Yeah.
Then to take responsibility for that, to recognize that precious things have been put in our hands, right? Not just for our grasping, but put in our hands. And then that to do nothing to honor them is to harm them. So I can see a kind of a self-transcendence through the recognition of the beauty of creation that invokes a kind of responsibility.
Yeah.
So that's what I was thinking.
Oh, I think that's to borrow your word, that's very beautiful.
It was beautiful.
It's lovely as well. It's lovely.
I think the thing is, what's really interesting and striking, one thing that's really interesting and striking about the very striking passage that you read is the way he says, it requires a kind of courage to see. It requires a kind of courage to see the way things actually are. And I mean, I think one of the big dynamics of grace is the possibility of opening us up to realize, I mean, you can live in two different versions of the universe. You can live in the version of the universe that's hostile to you, and you can live in the version of the universe where it's a gift first, and it's friendly to you, and that's an enormous difference, I think, even if all of the facts are the same. I mean, of your experience. So I often will talk with students about something like Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, or the short story called, I think it's called Greenleaf by Flannery O'Connor. And O'Connor's great about getting inside somebody's stream of consciousness, even when it's a sort of third person narration. So you're inside this woman's stream of consciousness, and you're seeing the world the way she sees the world. And of course, everything's against her. Everything is always, she's ill done by. And, you know, that's in a way the whole kind of Manichae storyline I've got, you know, at the end, she just has this little glimpse of the thing that you're talking about, of the possibility of a revolution in the way that she sees everything that's happened to her and all of the other people who are involved with it. And that's the saving possibility. That's the possibility of salvation, is the scales falling.
Bob?
Well, I've just been following this discussion with great interest. In many ways, Jeremy's students remind me of my own, and my own experience is very similar to his. I teach, fortunately, I have a year-long honors course that I teach, and so I could go, you know, I go from Plato to Augustine to, I do some Buddhism, and then I go into, you know, Descartes and Pascal and up to, oh, who else? I do Nietzsche and Scheller and so forth and so on. And actually one of the theme that I kind of didn't purposely start off with, but actually has developed over the years of teaching it, is I've now kind of structured the theme on the goodness of being. I mean, that as the basic question of philosophy, and then its loss. Yeah, particularly I think, and I know Descartes is the favorite whipping boy of a lot of how should we, certain types of philosophers, but I think you see that there, you know, with the loss, you know, with Descartes, with his dualism and with his reduction of truth to what is coherent in the mind and not what corresponds to the real. And you know, for Plato, the real and the good and the true are all interlinked. I mean, you know, in the Phaedo, when he talks about how do we know something? Well, we know something when we know whether it is good or not, whether it's good of that kind, whether it's a good circle or a good triangle or whatever. And you know, I had them read Pascal as Pascal sort of exploring what does it mean to live in a universe that's not good. You know, what is such a universe even meaningful? Can you even have a meaningful life, you know, in such a universe that is completely devoid of goodness, or is completely neutral or even hostile, as Jeremy was saying. So anyway, so I just found this whole conversation fascinating, and I found Jeremy's paper really really brought together some things that I've been thinking about, and certainly the last point that he made about looking at the universe either as hostile or as a gift, I think goes to the heart of the matter. And one other thing right now I'm working on a book on Tolkien, which is kind of a side thing of my own, because I do teach a course in Tolkien as philosopher, and he talks about the whole process of recovery in fantasy and the recovery of the world as seeing the world as a gift. And this, I think, is really so. It's been very helpful to me.
That's great. I mean, that's one of the things I like. I mean, Tolkien is a little bit more dense. I would love to be able to use it, but I use a lot of different things from C.S. Lewis as kind of icebreakers with the kids, because he's, although actually it's amazing how I'm always amazed at how much misunderstanding they can have, but it's because they bring all this stuff to the text, so they find it in there, whether it's there or not. But he's a good one to talk about, because he opens up that very issue that you're talking about. I mean, The Great Divorce is just showcasing, you know, it's like the city of God writ small, so to speak, two fundamental orientations to the world, two fundamental possibilities of the way you have yourself in relation to everything else. And the only thing that really gums up the works in terms of their ability to appreciate that book is about them is that they somehow keep on imputing all kinds of strange things to God that Lewis isn't really doing.
Actually, Tolkien and Lewis, as friends, they were always criticizing each other, where Tolkien is the one who actually brought Lewis back into the fold, but he was always critical on Lewis himself as being too much on the nose in his writing. And Lewis was, well, when I get through with 2,000 pages of yours, I can tell you whether you're on the nose or not. They were good friends, but they had that kind of. I just wanted to note one thing for me from the discussion, and it might also go back to the original presentation, but mainly from the discussion, is that it's always a mystery to me, or a hope of, if I just read the right text, if I just think the right thought, will that change me, or will I change my students with this? And it's always coming with a question mark. I never have this kind of certainty that this is going to happen. Rav Shabtai has much more of a certainty about this than I do. I mean, even if he says that they're free to do what they will, and they will make up their own opinions, there's more certainty in my teachers than there is in me. That's what and I felt that with your presentation, I think.
You felt what? That I was more
that you have that you pose the question, that you pose the question without deciding it, without telling us, well, this is your reading material, go forth.
Right. Well, I think, I mean, I believe in grace, operative grace, prevenient grace. So the thing is, if the kids, if they have the questions, and if their heart is being moved, you can really help them. You can remove the obstacles that prevent them figuring out what's happening to them and what they could be. But if they don't have that, or if it's really deeply occluded, I mean, I assume that the finger of God is at work in every one of those hearts, but in some it may be deeper than I can help them,
Yeah.
So I just try and think to myself, there's some who will be open to it, and you try and give them the best service that you can. But I think only God plucks the heart of stone and gives the heart of flesh. So I never go in there thinking, if I just put it the right way, I'll be able to do that myself.
The point of the hostile universe versus the lovely universe.
Yes.
I love this English use of lovely, that has love and beauty together.
Yes.
We don't have it in Hebrew. It is, there is, of course, one problem, because if you say it exists, it's the universe, ergo, it's lovely, it's not hostile, it's a bit dangerous. This is dangerous, because something you should reject, you should fight against. Some things are hostile.
Yes.
You cannot say because it exists, that's why I love it. And this is what Julia meant. I think that's what I got from the sense of aesthetics that we have to develop. Otherwise you will not fight. If we don't have a very clear sense of aesthetics, of moral aesthetics.
Yeah, this is a complicated issue, and I don't go very far with it, with the kids. I mean, in my own thinking, of course, but what I want them to think about is that the universe is the object of a loving choice by God to make the universe in which they exist, and that they themselves exist because God loved them into being and wants something lovely for them, namely himself. But if you were going to do it, I mean, the question that you're raising, you would really have to get them to think through carefully the problem of evil and the mystery of it. And what is it doing in a universe that is actually objectively lovely? I mean, if it's true that being is convertible with the good, and it is true, then you have some work to do. What the closest I come to it is, because I'm having them read the Confessions, they kind of follow along Augustine's struggle with the problem of evil and the goodness of the universe.
Because may I
Yeah, please.
interject something? Because this convertibility of being and goodness does not mean their interchangeability, right? So
Right.
it is simply not true that everything there is good, absolutely speaking, right? That's why there is this tricky relationship between the predicability of being and goodness absolutely versus in some respect, right? This is the point Aquinas makes very beautifully in question 5 of the Summa article, question 5, article 5. And it is very neatly worked out, and it is very difficult to convey to the students unless you have all sorts of and lots of good examples of good examples of bad things, for instance, and the example is good, and the as an example, in this respect, it is good, but what it is about, in that respect, it can be horrible.
Sure.
Right? So, so we need to be able to convey these nuances and the nuanced language, and the nuanced language.
Well, I never want them to
tackle these
good
issues
without talking about good for what.
Yeah.
But I mean, you would have to do other kinds of problems like malum culpe and malum pene, and I mean, you'd have to get them to really start making some careful distinctions, which I only scratch the surface on with these undergraduates because it's just their core.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, but I'm just to take this apparently very plausible thing. You cannot say that something is good unless you can answer good for what. But the whole point is that there are, and there is maybe just in a singular, something that is good without being good for something. Right?
Well, that's right. But
So,
that's the purpose of that exercise of moving from the contingent good.
Exactly, and that is exactly what how Aristotle targets this idea of eudaimonia in the first place. That's how he begins his Nicomachean ethics, right?
Right.
So,
but the thing is, you have to put with the students, you have to put the for what in there because you have to start to get them to think teleologically again, which they don't want really to do.
mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, actually, the first thing when I start my ethics course is, what the hell are you doing here? Don't you have anything better to do with your time? Why did anyone force you to be here? Yeah, sort of. So why? Yeah, because it's a compulsory course. Okay,
Yes.
but aren't you free? You're free to
everything is
suffer the consequences. And so, but I need to take this for the credit. So there is something good that you want to achieve by this. What is it? Oh, a diploma. What is the diploma for? Et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. What is the job for? What is the money for? What is that house for? Et cetera, et cetera. But is there anything eventually that you cannot ask any further? That what is that good for? And that is the ultimate good.
Yeah, that's right.
I am very glad that Rav Shabtai raised the question of evil because the good and the being, as you say, they are not interchangeable. Ensed verum, ensed bonum, non convertuntur. They are not the same thing. So there is a lot of evil, and students know that. They experience it also.
I'm not talking about human evil, but also evil in the universe, in the very existence of the universe.
Evil secundum quid.
You have to cope with it, meaning the good would be to cope with that evil, to take into account this obstacle. And this is a realistic approach, not a utopic one. And this is also linked to the question if being itself is not very problematic, meaning that one has to ask the question then, can one come from doing something which is not for its own sake to something which is can you come from something which is not not for its own sake to something which is for its own sake? Can you come from doing something in function of something else to doing something not in function to something else? Meaning, is it possible to realize the good as it is for itself, not in function of myself? That would be the
I would like to make, I'm tempted to make,
anyhow.
Yes, Professor Meyer. Yes, I stopped you in the middle.
No, I just want to contribute to the conversation that if evil exists and it exists, then the being and the good are not the same thing, and then we have to cope with it, and then our task would be to realize the good not in function of myself, but in function of the good for itself. And this is a kind of, I would say, transformation. It would be a self-transcendence which leads to a self-difference, that you have the other within yourself, that you are concerned in our difficult Corona times with other people who don't have money or bread or work. Meaning, these are not intellectual discussions. These are the concrete reality with which one has to cope. So I'm glad you, Rav Shabtai, raised the question of evil, because you can't talk about morality without raising the question of evil.
The thing is, one of the reasons that I only wanted to get into it in a preliminary way in this little paper, but also probably in this conversation, I think this is going to maybe kind of be a strange way to put this. I mean, you can have a sort of a philosophical theodicy that consists in analyzing these problems and making the proper distinctions that you need. But at the end of the day, I mean, a Christian account of the problem of evil has to be, it seems to me, centered on, not that it doesn't need those things, but I think it sublates them into the question: what is God doing in Christ? And what is the meaning of take up your cross and follow me? What does God invite us to do as God's partners in facing the situation of evil in the world? So when I'm dealing with it with students, I don't want to go there right away until I prepare them to talk about that part of the thing, the law of the cross. So
I would like to make a suggestion. First of all, about a date for our next meeting, I suggest August 24th. It's convenient for you.
let me just look at my calendar real quick.
And then suggest something to talk about, to follow this, I think, most important religious dialogue, because I think that the philosophy and definitions, I know how important exact definitions are, but I think that transcendence is a very important subject. I would like to discuss a story, a parable. You know, like
Yes,
the parable is not King Solomon's, but it's much later. It belongs to a Hasidic rabbi, Rab Nachman of Breslev, and it's called The Wise Man and the Simpleton.
nice.
And it's a beautiful story, unbelievable parable that was discussed and quoted in Jewish philosophy and Jewish thought so many times, and I think no one got it right. And
Maybe I
think
should.
and I would suggest that maybe you could see some paragraphs of that, or I'll send you the English translation. It was told in the spoken Jewish dialect of German at that time, Jewish, in Yiddish, in Jewish. It was translated and it was read to English in a fairly good translation. I'll send you the whole story. We could not go over the whole story. I would like to learn a paragraph that really discusses in a very expressionistic way the idea of transcendence, the point that we discussed today. So if you'd like, this is my suggestion, and then Julia could help me with the aesthetic, with the thing of aesthetic discerning, the discerning between good and evil and the beautiful universe. All these ideas are there in this story. So if you won't mind not to have a presentation, but to have a story, okay?
Sounds right.
Okay. And what about the date? The 24th is okay?
That suits me okay.
My first teaching day.
Yeah, we're starting a little early too. We're starting on the 17th, but I should be free that afternoon, I think.
I'll be free. I'll be free.
Yes, and you, David, also free in the afternoon?
Yes, I teach at 8 and 9 a.m. on campus, I believe.
On campus?
On campus, yeah.
And we're teaching on campus too, although a lot are opting for online, but I'm going to teach on campus.
Just as a quick question, just to compare experiences, were you given an option to pick on campus or online, or were you?
Yes.
Not exactly. We have to have a reason. We have to have it has to be an application and it has to be approved. So
yeah, it's an application in our part too.
Okay.
the university really wants to have classes. They really want to. I mean, they have so much money invested in those dorms. They have to make some money on those.
Yeah.
On those
They could be sold, sold to entrepreneurs.
At Georgetown, we were just given the option without requiring applying or asking.
They have money at Georgetown.
Wow.
Yeah, and then they keep telling us that we're going to lose 100 million. So,
right. But were you
probably will?
Do you have a salary freeze or salary reductions?
Yeah.
Salary reduction, 5%.
Oh, reduction. Oh,
5%.
Georgetown had a salary freeze. Georgetown had a salary freeze, no hiring freeze, and voluntary opting for salary reduction, but also no contributions to retirement funds for staff.
that's what we have. Yeah,
Bill, I begin to suspect the conspiracy theory that the heads of the universities created this virus.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if the online catches on, they must be really worried. So they don't want they don't want
I can sit in my yard under my tree,
exactly.
my pipe, and give my classes.